morning, everyone. Sort of keeping you waiting. I wasn't aware, this is the first time I've managed a webinar, so I wasn't aware there were people in the waiting room. I would have had you join us sooner. Sorry about that. We'll wait just a minute till 5 past before starting. Good to see some familiar names, no friends, colleagues. And people I'm sure will join us as we go along. Neve, I'll ask you to record us as well. Just bear in mind that we will invite people to unmute their microphones or and ask a question. You can use the chat facility or the Q&A function as well to pose a question or make a comment. And as I said, because we're recording this, bear in mind that this will be posted online on YouTube on our video library there. So without much further ado, let me thank you all for joining us this morning for the launch of the National Integrity Index Private Sector for 2020. I'm joined here by Katherine Lawler, who is Advocacy Research Coordinator for TI Ireland. She joined us from the Department of Foreign Affairs in March, and she replaced Dr. Roland Joni, who had been Advocacy and Research Coordinator and author of the report up until the end of the end of 2020, and who sadly left us to join the Council of Europe as a senior researcher there. It's hard to hold on to good people, unfortunately, but delighted that Katherine was able to join us and get this project over the line. I'll in a moment I'll just show you the agenda. I can just share my screen. Doesn't matter how many times I host a Zoom meeting, I still look like a novice. So here we are. I'll put this in display mode so you should be able to see the home slide. And well, I'll just briefly introduce you to TI Ireland for those of you who are joining us for the first time who aren't familiar with Transparency International. I'll then talk you through the background to the project, and then hand you over to Katherine, who will talk you through the methodology, the results and recommendations before we turn to questions and answers. So for those of you who don't know us, Transparency International Ireland, or TI Ireland, is a chapter of Transparency International, a worldwide network of non-profit, non-partisan organizations tackling corruption around the world, undertaking research, advocacy and support services for people and organizations. And TI Ireland was launched in 2004. I founded the organization having worked for Enterprise Ireland in New Zealand and at the Irish Consulate in Auckland. And prior to that, I had a background in public relations and press. TI is probably best known for the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is or can be described as a league table of the least and most corrupt countries in the world, according to international business opinion and or expert opinion. And Ireland, sorry, just to go back, Ireland is perceived, it's not an actual measure of corruption, but it's perceived to be 18th least corrupt country in the world out of 180 countries. And it has remained steady. It's it's only fallen out of the top 20 countries on the index since it was launched in 1995. The Corruption Perceptions Index is not the only product or tool that TI publishes. In 2009, for example, TI launched a qualitative analysis, TI Ireland launched a qualitative analysis of strengths and weaknesses of institutions and laws aimed at tackling corruption, known as a National Integrity Systems Assessment. These have been produced around the world, and they inform our general approach to tackling corruption, which is premised on an understanding of the role of our institutions and laws, which are underpinned by society's collective understanding of our values. We've also undertaken research on whistleblowing laws, which informed the Protected Disclosures Act in 2014. And we operate a helpline, the Speak Up helpline, which not only supports whistleblowers and witnesses reporting wrongdoing or looking for support and legal advice, but also generates anonymized data that allows us to analyze trends and patterns and make recommendations to government about how it can improve policy and legislation, and also to employers aimed at helping them create safer working environments for their workers. And more information can be found about the helpline on our website. We also in 2016 launched Integrity at Work, which again is aimed at supporting employers with a view to supporting their staff, their workers, in speaking up safely, directing them to available supports, including our helpline and a legal advice centre, the Transparency Legal Advice Centre, which we set up in 2016 to provide free legal advice to people, and which is also based on a pledge that employers take or sign, which commits them to taking action in response to disclosures of wrongdoing and ensuring that their staff are protected. So the National Integrity Index itself is based on our research, or as I explained earlier, our National Integrity System research underpins everything we do. And we look at more than just central government. So we are looking at institutions that have a pivotal, a key role in underpinning integrity in public life. And we began with local authorities. And just before I do it, jump ahead, I begin by thanking the Community Foundation of Ireland for Ireland for their kind support. This project wouldn't be possible without their help, and they've been supporting the project since it began in 2018. So I should also explain that this is not a measure of corruption or of the personal values of anyone working within the organizations we assess. Instead, it's aimed at measuring systems and procedures aimed at stopping corruption. And we began with looking at local authorities. This particular project is aimed or is focused on Irish-based companies. And later this year, we will look at semi-state bodies, and in 2022, we'll also look at systems and procedures within public bodies. The work is also informed largely by the work of our colleagues around the world, in Berlin, London and elsewhere, who've produced rankings and analyses of companies in their home countries or international companies, and looked at their commitment to sharing information around their anti-corruption procedures. And we've also been informed by the work of chapters looking at municipalities, local authorities, which has informed our Local Authorities Index in 2018 and 2019. We hope also to be able to update this index, the findings of this index later this year, to allow us to see any progress made over the course of the last 12 months or so. I'll just briefly explain or just go through the findings of the last index, which should give you an idea as to the impact it has had, and some general trends. And we use a heat map indicator to show the preparedness to a large degree of local authorities to tackle corruption and their willingness or ability to share information in the public domain, which demonstrates their commitment to stopping corruption. And you can see the impact here. It's best illustrated in the fact that so many local authorities improved their standing from 2018 to 2019. We saw an overall improvement by 10% in the scores of local authorities from 2018 to 2019. We saw 3 local authorities score over 70%, in contrast to just 1 in 2018. And we saw a sharp increase in the scores of Wexford County Council, Galway County Council and Kilkenny over the course of 12 months or so. So it demonstrated or illustrated the improvements that can be made in a short space of time in organizations' practices, and also in the amount of information that they're willing to put out into the public domain. And this is important in large part because their stakeholders, the public, not just those working inside county councils or any organization, need to be able to see for themselves what measures are in place to address wrongdoing, and to convince them and assure them that they're acting in the public interest and that they have their interests at heart. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Katherine. I'm happy to take any questions on the index as well. And I should just also add, my name is John Devitt. I'm Chief Executive of TR Ireland, and I'm also co-editor of the report with Katherine. Like I said, please feel free to ask any questions or post any comments, and we will come back for Q&A and discussion when Katherine has talked you through the findings and the recommendations. Katherine.
Thanks, John. I'll just start sharing my screen. Again, feeling like a bit of a novice here. 1 second.
We'll make the PowerPoint available as well if people want it after the event. Katherine, how are you getting on there? Yeah. Great. You can see the notes slide there. Do you want me to go back and show my slide? And you're muted as well.
Yeah.
Do you want me to show my screen?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about this. You want to stop sharing? I'll just show mine. So over to you, Katherine. I can move through the slides.
Okay, so the first one there in this section, if you can show the context to the, so John's obviously given the background to the broader project. The focus on the private sector, as outlined here, is that research by national and international organisations indicate that despite the strong performance in the perceptions index that John went through earlier, there are still risks of bribery and corruption in Irish companies. And as well as that, the transparency around them is an important aspect of a company's reputation, and how they disclose the measures that they have in place is an indicator of their commitment to this. There's also, as well as reputational issues, there can be legal penalties around not having the policies that we looked at in this survey in place, where companies are obliged to show that they've taken all reasonable steps and performed due diligence against corruption. As well, international research on this has shown that where there are robust frameworks in place in companies, these can help to detect and manage risks and see them off, and instill a culture of good practices in respect of anti-corruption and bribery. If you move on to the next slide, John, please. So this, again, similar to the other local authority and other indices, builds on the methodology developed by other Transparency International chapters that have done research into the corporate sector in their countries. In this one, we've looked at transparency on these 4 pillars: anti-corruption, organizational structures, political engagement, and whistleblowing. Again, it's important to emphasize that it's not an assessment of performance against these pillars, but that we've looked at how well prepared companies are in these areas, and how publicly they disclose their preparedness and the measures that they're taking, and as well their reporting, not just their policies. It aims to identify and promote good practices. So I'll show you later on the website that we have. There'll be examples there of good practice against the indicators in these 4 categories. And so the 4 categories that I just described, we had 30 indicators in total across the 4 categories. There are 30 questions, 1 point available per question, so fairly simple, 30 points maximum available. The scoring prioritizes the public disclosure, as we've emphasized, of policies and reporting. So we were looking for companies that had, through their own corporate communication channels, released data on their policies, released their policies and data on reporting against those. So where companies perhaps had partially met the criteria, or subsequently gave us evidence that they were meeting criteria, they were given a half a point. Then this was converted to a percentage, and we've come up with an overall ranking and rankings in each of the 4 categories. Yeah, the next one, please. I won't go through each of these indicators. I'll just, they will be, as I said, on the website, but just to give an overview here, and you can see what we're looking for here. So in terms of anti-corruption, it's very much focused on the public statement of commitments against bribery and corruption, and also focuses on setting a tone from the top. So for instance, that the senior management supports these policies publicly. And as well, there is a focus on making sure that these policies are seen to extend to third parties that the companies engage with, be that contractors and suppliers, because companies can be held responsible legally for their acts, but then also to set the tone and the culture as well. The next one is the organizational transparency section. So this looked at reporting on company structure, subsidiaries, and so on, as well as country by country reporting. So these have, I think, an evident importance to see where a country is operating and their financial reporting there. We also included under financial reporting, charitable donations and community contributions, which have an obvious financial aspect. I'll get into later on the way that that's not reported on so much in a similar way to how companies report on their revenue, capital expenditure, and taxes. The next category is political engagement. So we looked here to see whether companies had policies on responsible corporate political engagement. So covering aspects like lobbying, revolving door hiring of public officials and politicians, and whether they made a public statement of political neutrality. And then the final category is whistleblowing. So again, looking for whistleblowing policies, looking to see that those extend to third parties that deal with the company, and that they're in line with the Irish legislation and guarantee not to retaliate against whistleblowers. So to foster a culture where whistleblowing is a safe thing for employees to do. So then I think the next one is this is just to give an overview of the research. So this, as John explained at the start, there was a previous researcher, Roland Joni, who carried out this research with some assistance last summer. So we looked, as I said, we were looking at publicly available material, and the time frame that had to have a delimited time frame to look at that was June, July last year. Then there was a preliminary feedback stage with companies where they could maybe point out where something had been overlooked, or if they had policies that were being enacted but were internal and not publicly available. So these were reviewed, and then we did an audit of all the scores for to make sure that everything was consistent, and had some more feedback, another feedback period with companies last month. And now we're finally publishing the report today, and hoping to update it towards the end of this year or early next year, not to release maybe another report, but to update the index and hopefully reflect some improvement and progress in the categories then. So the next one is, the summary of results is on the next slide, and then I'll go into sort of drill deeper into the categories. So as you can see in this table, the overall maximum score was 68%, and the mean was 51%. So on average, companies were meeting just over half of the indicators. And as you can see in the middle column there, there were companies in the survey who didn't score anything overall, and who didn't score in the individual categories. Anti-corruption is the best performing category. 10 companies achieved, so third achieved 100% in that category, and the mean was 80%. So that's reflective of good levels of disclosure of policies, and that those policies themselves are generally robust and in keeping with the provisions that we would want to see against the indicators. The next one there, organizational transparency, is not a high scoring category in terms of the mean, although as you can see by the maximum, there were some outliers who did relatively well. In organizational transparency, we didn't see much by way of release of full details of subsidiaries and full country by country reporting, which again, I'll get into. Responsible political engagement was the poorest performing category, as you can see there, 27%. The majority of companies didn't have a political engagement policy, but they received scores in respective elements of other policies and reporting that was available. The maximum score there is 57%. And then whistleblowing overall is the second best performing category with a maximum of 90%. But as you can see, the mean is somewhat lower there. And that's reflective of the fact that although there were policies available, in many cases they weren't fully in alignment with Irish legislation, which we'll get into again when we look at that category maybe in more detail. So here is a ranking. The companies ranked by their overall score. This is across two slides, obviously, because there are 30 companies. As you can see, the best score is 68% there for AIB Group. And the top 10 ranked companies are from 58% upwards. The next slide has the remaining companies that we surveyed. Obviously, I won't list each one out. There are 30 of them, so we'll be here for a while. But the list will be, and all this data will be available on our website. Again, just as you're looking at this, just to stress that those scores, as we've said, are not a score on corruption, but on transparency and disclosure. So if you skip ahead, I think, to the next one, John. Yeah, I'll just go straight to anti-corruption here. So as I said, 10 companies scored 100% in this, and there was generally strong public availability. But within those policies, there was room, I should say rather, that the policies themselves were often inside a code of conduct. There were relatively few standalone policies. So the best practice would be to have a standalone policy that very clearly outlines what is considered bribery and corruption, measures to be taken against it, disciplinary measures, and so on. But the elements that were available were largely in line with good practice. There is, as I said, earlier we were looking for transparency of disclosure of policies, but also reporting. So there is room for greater detail on releasing data about dealing with corruption incidents and so on, and data on how these policies and their implementation is measured and monitored. There is also room for stronger requirements for third parties to adhere to companies' policies. A lot of the wording in policies might be similar to we ask third parties or we encourage third parties with whom we do business to adhere to these policies, whereas more robust language would take a stronger stand on that. Gifts, hospitality expenses, and conflict of interest policies as standalone documents were fairly rare, often folded into codes of conduct, and often conflict of interest policies lacked requirements to declare interests in advance of a conflict arising. So those are two things we wanted to highlight. Moving on to the next, this is the ranking of companies on the anti-corruption category specifically. So as you can see, very good performance there in terms of, largely over 85, 90%. And again, where scores aren't that high, there were cases where maybe there wasn't an anti-corruption policy, but in others it was simply that it wasn't disclosed. So as I said, the point of the aim of the exercise is to encourage, obviously, to have the policy, but to disclose it as well. In organisational transparency, full disclosure of subsidiaries is not at all standard. It's very difficult to get information on subsidiaries and how a company is structured, especially if it's operating across several jurisdictions. Ideally, it would be possible to go to a company's website and simply click on a tab and see their structure. But even where there is detail on subsidiaries, it's in annual reports, which are consolidated reports and don't show the non-consolidated subsidiaries that we would have been looking for against the indicators. Country by country breakdowns of financial reporting is not common. There might be regional breakdowns. And then information on charitable and community contributions was very rarely disclosed in a similar format to other financial reporting. It would be best to see it in a clear tabular form, including amounts and beneficiaries, so that because sometimes charity and community contributions can be a way to veil certain activities. So if this is more open and transparent, it's good for the companies as well, because it shows their commitment to the societies in which they're operating in a much clearer way, rather than when it's maybe in a narrative form where full information isn't available. The next slide should be the ranking of organizational transparency. So as I said earlier, there are some high performing companies in this section. Apple Green, Yards Times, PTSB did very well, and Aer Lingus. But largely there was very little information. As you can see, 25 or 26 companies scored 50 or below in this category. So that's reflective of the lack of information out there. It's not a reflection on their reporting. A lot of companies in their interactions with us and in their feedback stressed and pointed out that they are in keeping with their reporting obligations when it comes to financial reporting. But again, this isn't an assessment of that, it's an assessment of how clearly they or how openly they disclose that to the public. The next section is political engagement. Most companies lack a distinct policy on responsible corporate political engagement. So in most cases, there would be maybe in the code of conduct a reference to personal political activities by an employee of a company, and stating that they shouldn't use company resources for that, but very little by way of a fully articulated policy on the company's corporate political engagement. Generally, in terms of political contributions, there would be a statement in the annual report about there having been none, for instance, in the year covered by that report, but not a policy stance on political contributions. Details on lobbying expenditure similarly weren't disclosed. A lot of companies made the point that these are available publicly on lobbying.ie, but again, what we were assessing here was companies' active disclosure through their own channels, rather than a layperson or an interested party having to go to all these other resources. Lobbying.ie is a secondary channel that isn't directly the company promoting or its own transparency. Similarly, central information on lobbying positions was not common on companies' websites, and several companies had not publicly disclosed a position on political neutrality. The next one is the ranking there. As you can see, the high scores here, not as high as in other categories, so 57 being the highest. Some American headquartered companies were in general stronger on having a political policy, but their political policies, their political engagement policies would have been focused on the US context and didn't necessarily address their other operations worldwide. But as you can see, that the top 2, 3 there are US. Then moving on to the whistleblowing category. This was the second highest, best performing category, which again, similar to the anti-corruption category, shows that there is relatively good disclosure of policies. However, several policies made reference to good faith reporting, which is not a requirement under the Protected Disclosures Act. Good faith is understood to relate to motivation, and the Protected Disclosures Act specifically states that a whistleblower's motivation is not of relevance, and their motivation does not need to be good for them to enjoy the protections of the Act. However, they must have a reasonable belief. So there seems to be some conflation of good faith and reasonable belief. Reasonable belief refers to the individual's belief in the veracity of the report that they're making. Good faith refers to their motivation. So where a policy contained a good faith clause that someone would not face retaliation if their report is in good faith, we didn't give a full point for those, to maybe remind and encourage companies to reassess their policies and make sure that they're in line with legislation. Also, the majority of companies don't publish data on the reports received or actions taken. So whereas there was relatively good disclosure of policies, publishing data, so number of reports received and actions taken, demonstrates that those policies aren't simply a tick box exercise. So we would encourage companies to do that. And then also public confirmation that the staff handling those reports are specifically trained isn't common. There may be specific training programs in place in companies that haven't disclosed that, but again, publicly stating that can encourage people to make reports, and again shows that a company is taking their obligations in this area seriously and trying to create the right culture around handling whistleblowing reports. The next one should be the ranking. So again, you see good marks here from 70 up to 90, and generally a better performance than in some of the other categories, but again with room for improvement. And again, some of these lower scores would reflect a lack of availability of policies, or maybe policies that weren't in keeping with Irish legislation, as I said. So that brings us on then to the recommendations, which are, I suppose, implicit in what I've gone through in the findings. So as outlined here, to publish the policies and procedures online, which, as I said, many are doing, but threaded through codes of conduct and so on, and to adopt and disclose stronger policies on gifts, hospitality, expenses, and conflicts of interest, and to consider creating thorough standalone policies that would be publicly available. That's also of benefit not only to staff, employees, but also to those dealing with the company, so they can see what the standards are of the company with which they're dealing. Also to disclose anti-bribery and anti-corruption monitoring information, to disclose information on subsidiaries and financial reporting on a country-by-country basis. Then also, as I discussed, to disclose policies and information on charitable donations similarly on a country-by-country basis. Political engagement, as I said earlier, is the lowest performing category, and there's a distinct lack of policies, whereas we'll say under anti-bribery and anti-corruption, they were threaded through, but evidently present in codes of conduct. There's very, very little on responsible political engagement across various documents that we consulted for companies. Number 7 there, adopt provisions on revolving door and cooling off periods for the movement of directors and senior staff between the private and public sector. That was one of the weakest, perhaps the weakest indicator. 28 of the companies had no reference to this, and the 2 that did, they were provisions in other policies, and I think in one case they did have an internal policy on it, but it wasn't publicly available. And number 8, again, to review whistleblowing policies for compliance with the Protected Disclosures Act, and to share data on whistleblowing reports to demonstrate that those measures are being put into effect. And I think that should be the conclusion then. Again, to stress that this is a measure of corporate transparency, not corruption. The results, as you've seen, are positive in many respects, but as you can see in for instance, the organizational transparency category, there's very uneven performance there, from 0 up to 88%. Risk-based controls can help companies counter corruption and strengthen employees' anti-corruption attitudes and behaviour, and instill a culture that is beneficial across many dimensions for the company, both in terms of their exposure to risk, financial risk that can come from corruption, but also reputational and legal risks. Greater efforts should be made to increase transparency around political engagement in particular, but also the country by country reporting, and to improve whistleblowing policies. And then making this information available is a cost-effective way. In many cases, the information is there, the policies are there, but making them public shows a commitment to accountability, fosters trust among stakeholders, and stakeholders can be widely understood as shareholders, but also the general public, societies in which companies are working, and to build a strong reputation for adhering to the highest principles.
So thanks, Katherine. And we had one question in during while the discussion was ongoing, to ask whether there would be an update in the private sector's or an update of the private sector results. And I think you answered that, or we answered that question already. We were hoping to be able to update the index later this year. While we won't produce this in-depth an analysis of the results, they will be made available online as well. And going forward, if funding allows, we'll continue to update the index, this and other indices that we publish as well. So if you would like to use the Q&A or chat function, I think you can put up your hand and ask a question, but otherwise feel free to ask any questions or post any comments you might have.
John, I intended to just very briefly show the website.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Be able to manage to share my screen for that. Or did I speak too soon? I know I have it here. So this could be live already, but certainly will be later today. Can you see my screen okay there?
Yeah.
So this is the landing page for the private sector index, and it will list all the companies here in alphabetical order, and then it can be sorted on rank and score. There's another sub page which has all the 4 categories, so it can be sorted by those as well. And then you can click into any of the companies and you'll be able to see the indicators listed, and the justification for why a particular score was awarded to that company, and links to the documents that we consulted. So it's a pretty user-friendly tool that will have all the data there for review. There'll also be a sort of a toolkit of good practices and other materials available on our website. That's transparency.ie, as well as the report, of course.
Thanks, Katherine. And bear in mind as well that the results from previous indices are available on our website as well. I haven't seen any questions come in or any comments other than the previous one. Or do we have another one? Do we have a scale? Do we know the scale of corruption and bribery in private companies? Is this an unknown quantity? Yes, to a large degree. I think it would be impossible to determine with any degree of reliability what the actual scale of corruption is in any organization. And bearing in mind as well that malpractice doesn't just affect companies. We also, through our helpline, have observed a large volume of complaints or concerns raised by staff in charities as well, and non-profit organizations. And the aim of this phase of the project, as I said earlier, is to analyze systems in beginning with local authorities, private companies, then on to semi-state bodies and public bodies. But the important point to make here is that what we can measure is the preparedness of these organizations to tackle corruption or tackle any type of malpractice. And key measures for private companies are their ability, a willingness to disclose financial information, to have policies and procedures aimed at tackling corruption, policies and procedures aimed at supporting whistleblowers and encouraging them to come forward and share information and to take action in response to concerns, and then also to govern their relationships with policymakers and public officials. And the responsible political engagement criteria isn't just focusing on donations made by companies to political parties. We notice that very few large companies are now making donations to political parties or candidates in Ireland because the limits on both disclosure and the threshold, or the thresholds for disclosure, and the limits on how much you can donate to a political party is €2,500, don't really make it worth anyone's while to try and influence political parties by making these donations. So there are other ways to exert influence over public policy, which aren't necessarily captured by legislation either. We have lobbying regulation on the statute books, Lobbying Regulation Act since 2015, but that currently only compels those lobbying public officials, senior public officials and public representatives to disclose details or an overview of their communication with those public officials and the aims of or the objective they had in mind when engaging with the public officials. It doesn't compel them to share any more information than that. And that this corporate political engagement indicator is aimed at encouraging more companies to be more proactive in sharing this information. There's far more information shared in the US than is the case in Ireland, in large part because federal and statewide or state level lobbying rules often require companies to share details on, for example, how much they're spending on lobbying, or to share more details about what they lobbied on or around. And similarly, there more information is available in Brussels on the transparency register there that allows people to see what companies like Google or Facebook are doing to influence public policy or regulations and directives in Brussels. So what we're aiming to do here is not just measure preparedness to tackle corruption, but also companies' willingness to be open with the public about how they're trying to exert influence, and in turn that will help address malpractice. To come back to your question, it's not a measure of bribery. We can't really measure actual levels of corruption. I mentioned earlier, we publish a corruption perceptions index annually, on the understanding that it is a useful proxy for actual levels of corruption. It's virtually impossible to measure the actual degree to which any country is affected by corruption. Similarly, it's impossible to tell how much corruption or malpractice is affecting a company, unless it's obviously brought into the public domain. The company is charged with an offence, or there's a tribunal of inquiry, or so on. Yeah, as I said, the aim here is to encourage people or organizations to be more open, and in turn to also build trust with their stakeholders. We've noticed a decline over the last decade or so in public trust in institutions across the board, in public, private, and in non-profit organizations. And it's incumbent on us to be more open about what we're doing to rebuild that trust. We can't assume that people will take our word for it as directors or chief executives. We need to be far more open about it, and there's an understanding too that, I mean, if TI Ireland were subjected to this analysis, we ran it ourselves last year, and we didn't perform as we should have. We reached, I think, it was 80-90%. Still not good enough. There's always room for improvement, and more information that's shared, the better it is for people to see where that improvement, that the room for improvement lies. On the understanding that many eyes are better than just one pair when it comes to governance and improving compliance and rebuilding trust. I'm not sure we get any more questions here or comments. As such, people should be able to raise a hand or speak if they want to. Katherine, did you have anything to add?
No.
Great. Like I said, all this information is online. Please feel free to send us an email if you'd like to learn any more, if any companies have been taking part in the, or have been included in the index and they want to learn more about the findings, or want to learn more about how they can improve their disclosure practices. Please feel free to contact us too. Like I said, this video will be available online on YouTube after we finish, and the results and all the findings and examples of best practice will be on our website too, transparency.ie. If we don't have any more questions, I might wrap up unless you have anything else to add, Katherine. Nothing at all. Excellent.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and have a great day and weekend.
Yeah, so no, thanks, Katherine. Thanks for all your hard work on this, for turning it around so quickly as well. And thanks to all the volunteers, staff, Niamh, for hosting this event. Thanks for. And as I said, please feel free to get in touch. And like I said, this video will be available on YouTube, results on our website, and do spread the word. Thanks again, and hope to see you again in the not too distant future. Take care. All the best.